I think people in general, when you mention mummies, they think of the mummies they've seen at the museums. The Egyptian mummies, the ones who are elaborately wrapped in a swaddling cloth, you know, the ones that are in a sarcophagi, the elaborate cartonnage and other paintings and so on. I think that's what most people think about mummies. And what I didn't even realize till I started studying mummies, that there are literally thousands and thousands of mummies that were never intended to be mummies.
Dr. Larry Cartmel is a pathologist and director of the clinical laboratory at Valley View Regional Hospital. His job requires him to focus on the diagnosis of tissue diseases and causes of death among the recently deceased. However, it is the distant past that attracts his spare time. His main hobby places him in the role of paleopathologist, or a pathologist who conducts tests on ancient humans, in other words, mummies. He has traveled well beyond the United States to aid archaeologists and anthropologists as they uncover ancient civilizations, and he has become one of the foremost authorities on mummies in the international scientific community.
I've always had an interest in archaeology. I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, and we had a lot of row crops, and you know, you find arrowheads and other types of artifacts when you're doing that. So it kind of created an interest in archaeology. When I got out into practice, I actually continued amateur archaeology. You know, Ada's a great area for that. There are a lot of ancient Indian sites around here. Later on, I volunteered to go work at actual archaeological sites, just as a worker, putting pieces of pots together and shards and arrowhead fragments and so on, and really enjoyed that. That was kind of a 2-week vacation away from pathology to do that. In 1988, I heard about a project in Chile where they actually had a number of mummies that had been removed by construction, and they were beginning to deteriorate, and they were looking for interested individuals to maybe go down and help do some work on those mummies. That was actually the first time I was exposed to mummies.
At that point, a mummy hunter was born. Dr. Cartmel felt the beginnings of a passion that would consume his life from that point forward. He also knew from a scientific standpoint that the people who had been preserved from the ancient past are a window back in time. Mummies are valuable not only for the historical context they provide, but also for present and future medical purposes.
Since I've started doing this, well, of course, there are various ways to examine mummies, from just an external examination and taking skin and hair samples to complete dissections where the mummies will eventually be lost to some sort of destruction. And I've examined well over 100 in that period of 12 years. It's very interesting because we can study diseases that have never had modern therapies applied. Parasitic diseases, other diseases such as cancer, infections, etc., that actually run a natural course, and we can open up some avenues into the natural history of some ancient diseases, and that translates perhaps into helping us in with modern diseases.
To study the mummies, Dr. Cartmel introduced a unique procedure in the hope of finding the answers to a few anthropological questions.
The first time I was in Chile, I noticed that the great majority of the mummies had hair preserved. And at that time, in the late 80s, there was a new technology being introduced into laboratories in the United States, and that was the examination of human hair for potential drugs of abuse. Basically, what happens when you take the drug, in this instance we'll just use cocaine for example, the molecules of the cocaine get into the bloodstream. And then as the hair grows, of course hair is nourished from the blood, and as the hair grows, these drug molecules are incorporated into the hair shaft. And as the hair grows, the hair shaft becomes a virtual timed record of drug exposure. So we can harvest the hair and actually test it for drugs. And we know that the ancient people in South America used the coca leaf for a variety of reasons, all the way from local anesthetic to an antidiarrheal. So we were interested to see if we could possibly detect those molecules of cocaine in very ancient hair.
His findings were successful in testing the mummy hair positive for drug usage. This form of testing had never been done before on a mummy. Since that time, Dr. Cartmel, along with his lab partner, Cheryl Weems, have become the go-to people in the world of mummy hair analysis.
We were the first ones to find cocaine in ancient hair, and we tested hair older than anyone had tested prior. It was just an idea he had, and so we kept trying and trying, and I remember that spring, it was very rainy. We were having all these really heavy rains. It was like in '89, I think. And finally, one night I was out here and it worked. And so I called him at home and I told him we were so excited. I mean, it was like, I can't explain it, but we were so excited to find cocaine. I mean, you know.
These tests went on to help anthropologists to further understand some of the practices of ancient cultures and the role the coca plant played in their daily lives.
Anthropologists in the past have never really known exactly how coca was used among the ancient populations. They knew it was important to them because it's represented in pottery. We see bags of coca leaf in burials. We actually see coca quids in between the cheek and jaw of many of the mummies. So the anthropologists could infer that yes, coca is obviously important to these people, but how was it used? Was it used ceremonially? Did they use it every day? The kids use it? Was it seasonal? Had no way for direct evidence on how it was actually used. You can actually take segments of the hair and determine whether it was used intermittently or whether it was used continuously. So we can get a very good idea then of how coca leaf was used in a particular society. So that's one of the ways that studying mummies can actually help answer historical or anthropologic questions.
Because the largest groups of mummies are not located here in the United States, Dr. Cartmel is required to travel outside this country to examine the mummies at the burial sites where he works closely with other scientists.
I've actually been to Chile and to Peru 6 or 7 separate times. The Atacama Desert there is actually the driest desert in the world. It virtually never rains in the desert. The ancient people were able to survive there because of runoff of fresh water from the Andes Mountains. The other place I've been to Egypt now 3 times. Of course, is an area where most people think of whenever they think about mummies. The last time I was there was last year. I was there to site just about a mile from the Nile River.
There are several ways in which human tissue can be preserved. Desiccation or dehydration is the best method and can sustain a mummy for thousands of years.
The oldest mummy I've ever personally examined has been about 6,000 years old, and this is one from down in Chile. They actually have much older mummies down there. Some of them radiocarbon date 9 to 10,000 years old. Of course, the ancient Egyptians probably had the best studied, and most of those are the elite of that society. But they had a very complicated process. They basically eviscerated the body, took out the internal organs, soaked it in a salt, a local salt they call natron, which absorbed all of the fluids and dehydrated the body. And as you know, they've obviously lasted quite a while. But basically, bodies have been preserved in a variety of methods, much the same way that you can preserve meat today. There's even sugar-cured mummies. There are mummies that have been smoked and preserved.
An American mummy that was preserved using somewhat modern techniques was that of Hazel Ferris. Hazel is a relatively new mummy and was the subject of a recent program on the National Geographic Channel. The producers of the show were in need of a paleopathologist to perform an autopsy to determine the exact cause of Hazel's death.
The Mummy Roadshow came about actually because I was referred to them by another pathologist who also did do mummy autopsies. I got an email and the subject said, National Geographic autopsy, mummy autopsy, and I thought, well, what is that all about? You know, and I thought it was somebody playing a joke on me.
Hazel Ferris lived about 100 years ago in Kentucky, and legend has it that she killed 5 men in one evening, her husband being the first victim. While on the run, she met a man who turned her into the police. Before she could be apprehended, Hazel took her own life by ingesting arsenic. It was the arsenic, supposedly, that preserved her body and made her a mummy. Dr. Cartmel was to examine for the true cause of death and put the legend of Hazel Ferris to the test.
So we negotiated back and forth. I wasn't really sure what they wanted from me or where they wanted to do this and so on. I wasn't sure what kind of equipment would be needed and so on. So I finally told him that if they would bring the mummy to Ada and use the morgue at Valley View and the equipment I was familiar with, that yes, I would do the mummy autopsy for them. And their next question is, where is Ada?
And so Hazel Ferris found her way to Ada and under the knife of Dr. Cartmel.
That was kind of a different experience for me. I'd certainly never done anything like that before. And then of course with the retakes and explaining things as we go along, it took a full 2 days for me just to complete the gross part of the autopsy.
Dr. Cartmel determined that Hazel Ferris died of pneumonia, not by poisoning herself, so the legend of Hazel Ferris was put to rest. However, another legendary mummy has been a part of Dr. Cartmel's life.
The Martindale mummy is a mummy that I actually came to own and was in my garage for a couple of years. One of the employees here in the laboratory in the early 90s came to me. She knew of my interest in mummies and told me that her great uncle had a mummy. And so the next day she brought me a postcard with the mummy on it. And so I asked her about her great uncle, if he still had the mummy and where the mummy was and so on. And he was still alive. He was very elderly. So I drove to Lawton to look at the mummy.
The owner of the Martindale mummy would travel from town to town, setting up in parking lots and charging admission for onlookers to get a glimpse of the mummy.
I asked him, his best weekend, he made nearly $500 in Plano, Texas. So I thought that was pretty good. My wife suggested I might want to do something like that when I retire.
Dr. Cartmel asked the owner if he could thoroughly examine the mummy. Perhaps aware that Dr. Cartmel could debunk the mystery, the owner denied the request. Just by looking at the Martindale mummy, Cartmel was almost positive it was a fake, but there was no way to know for sure until the mummy could be x-rayed and have tissue samples tested.
And then several years later, unfortunately, the gentleman passed away, and his widow called me and asked me if I'd like to purchase the mummy from her. So we negotiated and came up with a price that we could both live with. So I brought the mummy to Ada, and we studied it, x-rayed it, CT scanned it and various things, and did indeed prove that it was a fake mummy.
Like Hazel Ferris, the Martindale mummy was not without its own legend. The story goes that she was a member of a society of giants living in caves. Supposedly, she was found by gold prospectors working in the Yosemite Valley in the late 1800s. Yet another legend that Cartmel disproved. The Martindale mummy quietly slipped away and ended up in Cartmel's garage.
My daughter Jenny convinced me. She kept saying, "Dad, it's just too weird to have that mummy out in the garage." So I puzzled a little bit about what to do with the mummy.
After contacting Ripley's Believe It or Not, Cartmel found a more fitting home for the mummy.
And they were very interested in it. They thought it'd make a great display for them and so on. So they purchased the mummy from me and actually sent a person up to build a crate for it and take it down to their headquarters in Orlando, Florida. But interestingly enough, I received a bunch of newspaper clippings accompanying the Martindale mummy about where the mummy had been presented and displayed, and the mummy had actually been in the Dicus parking lot here in Ada, Oklahoma. I think it was in the 60s maybe. I can't remember the exact date, but there was an Ada connection. So
wherever in the world you may go, mummies are there to be found. Many of them come with tall tales or are shrouded in mystery. As long as Ada's own Dr. Cartmel is out there, you can be sure a lot of these ancient riddles will be solved.
I sure wouldn't have predicted that I'd be doing this. It's just sort of something that, fortunately for me, I sort of stumbled into, and I found a niche whereby I could help with archaeology and anthropology. I just feel very lucky and fortunate that I'm able to do this, and my wife and daughter allow me to do it. My wife always said, "Do not get him started talking about mummies. He will not shut up."